Welcome. My name is Graham Wilson, and I'm the director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. The Initiative on Cities serves a wide variety of purposes, but one of the most important is to assist, encourage, and promote discussion of research on urban life and issues by BU faculty. It's with those purposes in mind that we're gathering via Zoom to discuss Andrew Robichaud's book, Animal City, The Domestication of America. In this book, Andrew describes the disappearance from our streets, not only of the horses that pulled wagons and carriages or carried people, but of the cattle and pigs that once roamed them. Andrew also describes the growth of regulation of the treatment of animals and how those regulations are the precursors for policies that have shaped our cities today, including zoning. Andrew is a member of our distinguished history department. He's affiliated with the Initiative on Cities, and his teaching portfolio includes a course on the history of Boston. Some of you may have seen his recent fascinating article in the Globe on how 19th century Bostonians enjoyed winter, even though they lacked that sort of winter cold weather gear that we have today. Leading the discussion of Andrew's work is Professor Catherine McNeur of Portland State University. Her many publications include the prize-winning book, Taming Manhattan: Environmental Battles in the Antebellum City. She is currently working on what sounds to be a fascinating study of the neglect of women scientists in the 19th century, particularly two distinguished female scientists in Philadelphia in that century. We're fortunate to have such a distinguished scholar participate in this session. We're going to start with Andrew describing his work, move into a discussion between him and Professor McNeur, and last but far from least, we'll have a period after about 40 minutes for your questions and comments with responses from the featured speakers today. So Andrew, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to Graham Wilson and David Gross at IOC, along with Catherine Lusk at IOC. And thanks especially to Catherine McNeur, who for joining me in this discussion. Catherine had sort of asked me first to talk a little bit about what the origins of this project were, how I ended up coming to this rather unusual topic, though it's becoming less and less unusual since I first began researching Animal City about 10 years ago. And I think what really stood out to me as something of interest was just reading about these urban spaces in the 1800s. I came across at some point what became the opening story in this book, which is Charles Dickens's visit to Manhattan in 1842. And what he spends a lot of pages of that account talking about are the pigs in Manhattan, those free roaming gentleman hogs, as he calls them, who are mixing with these sort of well-to-do folks on Broadway and in more fashionable parts of the city. And these pigs are everywhere, as Catherine can attest to, because they're part of her book as well. And so I just got the sense that there was this really fascinating and incredible world that I wanted to spend more time in. There were pigs in streets, there were cows on city lots, there were, as we know, here in Boston, there were cows in the Common up until 1830. There were thousands and thousands of horses that created their own worlds, in a sense, in their own environments that I thought would be really interesting to try to understand. And of course, there were sort of the more unpleasant aspects of life too, the slaughterhouses, the stockyards, the hog ranches, as they were called, that were in some ways on the fringes of cities, that would move farther out of cities as a result of regulation, as Graham suggested. There were large populations of stray dogs, another topic that Catherine talks about in her book, Taming Manhattan, about New York. And so really there was this sort of rich and bright and colorful world that I wanted to spend more time in. And historians had made these gestures to what this world was, and that there were, that there were pigs, that they caused problems. But no one had really fleshed it out and put it at the center at the time that I started working on this. And so I really wanted to do that. And so, part of my interest was just this sort of curiosity. And then it really emerged that there was a sort of mystery here too, that was also not fully fleshed out, which was what happened. What happened from 1842 when Dickens is observing all these pigs in Manhattan, and I'm using this as a shorthand, but what happened from Dickens's New York to basically Upton Sinclair's Chicago in 1906? And I know those are different places, but one of the things I look at in the book is the ways in which these conversations are happening across different urban environments. And so there's a mystery. How do we get these really sort of lively, vibrant, multi-species, multi-industry spaces in the 1800s to what becomes a very segmented city, particularly as it relates to certain types of animals living and dying in urban environments. And what I realized sort of spending more time in this world, that there was not just a subtraction, that it wasn't just that cities came to regulate these spaces more intensely and push out domesticated animals and push out stockyards and push out slaughterhouses and tanneries and so forth. But they're also adding in new animals. They're adding in zoo animals. The 1860s to 1910s is the sort of the golden age of the development of zoos, urban zoos. So people are observing animals in new ways. People are interacting with animals that are exotic, that are from far away, that's related to sort of a popular curiosity, and also popular curiosity in nature and wildlife that's emerging at this time. And what's interesting is it's not, there's another species that that does increase as well. When we think about addition and subtraction, and that's the urban horse. And the urban horse has this brief sort of triumphant moment in the late 19th century when urban horse populations just boom. One historian has called this the gelded age because it's the late 19th century was this period of urbanization for horses as well. New York had over 100,000 by the turn of the century. Boston had tens of thousands. And so what I was seeing in the city really felt like, in some ways, the seeds or the beginnings of what are our modern relationships with animals, that we have these sort of invisible relationships as consumers, most of us in America, and that we also have these very visible kind of relationships with pets and with animals as entertainment. And what I suggest in the book is that the city of 1900, of 1910, really would be much more familiar to us in 2020 than the city only a few decades before, in large part because in some part because of the animal populations. So in the book, I go through some of these big changes. I talk about urban swill milk in New York, something that Catherine also knows a lot about, kind of a disgusting history of urban animal life and sickness. And they're actually feeding these massive dairy stables, they're feeding these cows distillery mash. So these are sort of the origins of feedlots in a sense. I talk about urban slaughterhouses and stockyards in San Francisco, the ways in which they're moved around the city over this period in the 1860s and 1870s through really intensive regulation. I talk about the development of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, SPCAs, which have their origins in England in earlier in the century, but really take off in America, in the United States, in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And where they take off is in cities. So these are very much urban institutions. And then I also talk about the development of pets. And so that's sort of a very broad overview of the book and where things began. I'll turn it back over to Catherine for wherever we want to go next.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to throw us right to the present, in a sense, at least. This past year with the pandemic, public spaces and cities have really transformed. In Portland, we've for a long time, we've had something called the Sunday Parkways that kind of go through the summer, where they close down a lot of streets and open it up to pedestrians and joggers and bicyclists. to make space for non-automobile activities like that, and sort of change the city kind of function that way. And the kind of associated open spaces project, Open Streets project, is like taking off in a lot of cities right now and trying to like at least semi-permanently make these streets closed to traffic, but open to pedestrians who can safely social distance, or bicyclists, or restaurants that need tables outside, and that sort of thing. So we're seeing a transformation and a reimagination of urban spaces. And it makes me think about the 19th century, because in both of our books, we kind of both deal with the transformation of urban spaces due to animals or diseases and other things that are happening, smells, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could talk about, I don't know, where you're seeing those sorts of changes in space in the 19th century, and a sort of upheaval of the way that people conceive of cities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You raise a couple of points there that that I'm thinking about the history in a little different way. We are living through, this major health scare. I mean, we talk about health scares historically, and as you know, studying urban history, that health scares are a way in which urban space in particular, gets really radically remade or rethought, reconsidered. And certainly, the way we move through spaces has changed profoundly in the last year, keeping social distance, just thinking about how those spaces are constructed on an individual level, and the ways in which a new kind of perception of health changes how we think about the spaces between people or urban spaces. I think it's a really interesting question. And I remember seeing, some people being really excited about the fact that streets in New York were closed down and people were dining on the streets like you might in a European city. And it remains to be seen, I think, how sort of lasting some of these alterations are and will be. But I think it's certainly a moment where people are rethinking urban spaces, much as they were in the 1800s around certain issues that we both explore. Your book in particular talks about the role of cholera in reshaping urban pig populations. A process that was really much more of kind of a back and forth over decades, where they're sort of teetering and trying to regulate and sort of facing resistance. But I think that when we think about the 1800s, when we think about urban environments and how they are constructing space, the key feature is really the sense of smell. How do people perceive smells? How are they trying to change the public? How is the public trying to change environments to account for smell? And smell being this really powerful way that people thought about and understood disease and illness. Something that our colleague Melanie Kiesel has written a whole book about. The 1800s being this place about that's very sort of obsessed with smell as a way of thinking about health. But this also has really profound implications for how cities are rebuilding human and animal populations, and how they're building urban environments. 19th century activists and officials are remaking urban environments to mitigate and control smells and effluents. They are living through one public health crisis after another. And cities have this sort of reputation in the 1800s and earlier of being these really unhealthy places. And a big source that they key in on are the slaughterhouses, are the stockyards, are the hog ranches, are the tanneries and bone boilers and glue makers that are all part of this sort of animal processing set of industries. And city officials across the United States and even internationally are talking with each other. They're learning from each other about how to regulate and remake space to make it more healthy in some cases. In some cases, there's corruption that creeps in which certain corporations or certain interests are trying to use space as an advantage to make greater profits off of their particular animal industry. But the case that I look at in San Francisco, which connects very much to other cities, was in the 1850s and 1860s, where this is really a central problem of urban life: is what do we do with these slaughterhouses? What do we do with these stockyards? And it's about the smell, and it's also about the uses of public spaces and urban spaces, the safety of city streets, the safety of, it's unsafe to have a sort of a cattle drive through a dense urban environment. These are all things they're thinking about too. The ways in which these urban swill dairies are befouling the air and the water. So there's a big push on animals and animal industries that's largely about smell, but it's about other things too. What's interesting is sort of thinking about smell and how does it shape cities still, and from the 19th century, is that they come not just to decide, at least in San Francisco, they come not just to decide we can't have the slaughterhouses and the stockyards in the downtown area. We're just going to push them out. They actually pick a very specific spot to locate them. And the place that they pick is one that's going to mitigate smell as much as possible. They actually build the slaughterhouses over the San Francisco Bay. So these are stilted slaughterhouses, and all the blood and offal falls into the bay and is washed away twice a day. That's the plan, at least. Very quickly, things go off the rails. And they also are talking about prevailing wind currents and how are wind currents going to sort of move odors away from the city. And there's a lot at stake here because as you know, there's this sort of really deeply interconnected sense of physical health and social and sort of cultural health as well. So they think there's a lot at stake in improving the health and wellness of 19th century cities.
So kind of related to this, especially talking about the slaughterhouses and everything, is just how much regulation of urban spaces, is a part of your book, kind of regulation of animal bodies, the regulation of industries that are related to the animals. So do you consider this a kind of early form of zoning prior to the zoning laws of the 20th century? I'm wondering if you could speak more about that.
Yeah, I do see it as an early form of zoning. I sort of, it's, as I said, it's, this is a deep sort of regulatory intervention. It's carving out particular places where you can do particular activities, types of work, where you can keep animals, where you can slaughter them. It's, by the late 1800s, there are rules on, if you were living in just about any American city, there are rules on how many animals you can have, where in the city you can keep certain animals, what types of animals. There are rules about how slaughterhouses operate. These were all sort of, developed over this period. And there's also very, very distinctive geographies around all of this. So, San Francisco creates a 36 block area that becomes known as Butchertown. And it's the only place in the city where you can slaughter animals. They don't call it zoning, but it's taking a particular urban space and it's designating specific uses to it. And what's interesting is that those urban spaces then sort of become what we might call sacrifice zones. So Butchertown is the place where you can slaughter and keep large herds of animals, and then it becomes the place where tanneries go, where the stockyards go. In the 20th century, it becomes the place where the sewage treatment plant is sited. It becomes the place where the biggest power plant in the region is sited. it becomes a radiological waste site. And so what begins as this sort of animal exclusion, this animal zone, really sort of creates this pathway into the 20th century and even into our own cities, of sacrifice zones in many cases. Now, some of them are, some of these zones of animal life and death are rehabilitated. They are rehabilitated into, residential space, but they really do sort of cast this sort of deep, this deep shadow on history. And as an example, there, I can talk about this more, later, but these spaces where these zones where animals are essentially sited in the 1800s, they do have this sort of, they do have a different feel to them. They do, they do look different in many cases. They, in San Francisco, the areas around Butchertown become really run down. In some cases, these former slaughterhouse districts are, neighborhoods are redlined. And they're redlined in some cases quite explicitly because they smell bad. And so that, it doesn't have, these neighborhoods don't have access to the same kind of loans and mortgages and investments that other parts of the city do.
It sounds like it kind of becomes an environmental racism or environmental justice kind of issue then, where you're probably seeing the creation of African-American neighborhoods or other minority immigrant neighborhoods around these sites too.
Yes,
I don't know.
absolutely.
Is that what you're seeing? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And there's an interesting, there's sort of an interesting dynamic around that. There's, when I look at maps of demographic maps, a lot of these slaughterhouse districts are heavily immigrant, heavily African-American, heavily lower income. And in San Francisco, it's even quite more explicit than that because, well, first of all, in the 1880s, the city is run by sort of rampant anti-Chinese supervisors, and they actually pass a piece of legislation. They pass an ordinance that says that Chinese living in San Francisco can only live in Butchertown. Now it gets completely struck down in the courts, but this is the kind of historical, racist thinking that is happening, and there's quite explicit racism happening in the 1880s, but then there's also a racism that happens in the 20th century, and San Francisco basically uproots its African-American population in the 1950s and 60s through urban renewal redevelopment programs. And the area around Butchertown is where many African-Americans relocate because there's a public housing project there. And so, in addition to citing all of these sort of toxic industries there, the city is also citing the public housing projects that will house many of the folks who are being uprooted from downtown. And I take my students out to Brighton, and you see similar dynamics there. That these neighborhoods, and I think that relates more to this issue of affordable and sort of low-end housing, and zones of the city that are not getting access to bank money and public investments over decades and decades. There's a very complicated set of reasons as to how these spaces become sort of more heavily African-American or more heavily immigrant, but that is the trend that you see.
So you mentioned taking your students out to see some of these sites. One of the things that I find really compelling about Animal Cities is just how much you kind of show readers how to see the animal ghosts of the city or see the impact that animals have had. And during the pandemic, I've spent the last year walking Portland streets, so running through the Portland streets, and because of my inclinations, like always looking for evidence of historic animals as much as I can. And we have these horse rings, these iron horse rings that are attached to the curb lines around the city, and they're historically preserved since the 1970s, so they're like permanently attached. And if you have to redo your curb, you have to make sure to put the iron rings back and everything like that. So I'm wondering how, you are the expert of kind of seeing these ghosts and seeing the transformation of a city, but like still looking back into the 19th century to see these ghosts. Can you tell us and anybody here how they can go about going on these walks and finding evidence of this stuff?
Yeah, I'm curious about these Portland horse tie, I don't know what you call them, horse rings.
Horse rings.
Do you know when the city started preserving those?
So they were probably put in around when the sidewalks went in, which is around like 1904, 1911, something like that. And then the city seems, I think there was in the 1970s, there was a push to preserve a very like a Portlander who was really into them, kind of heralded it and like pushed for them to be preserved, and so they were added on to the historic preservation laws. And so anytime you see some like sidewalks being redone, they're always it's part of the negotiation that they have to be there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to sort of have some greater preservation efforts of the infrastructure of the animal city. It's interesting you say that, because the house I bought a few years ago, one of the things I was most excited about was that it had a horse ring out front. And then I realized that the house wasn't built until 1915. And I thought, these are decorative. They're definitely definitely a decorative horse ring. And so it's just interesting to think how this animal city is also kind of romanticized, and it's sort of thought to be quaint. And I hope that Animal City will disabuse people of some of that quaintness. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that experiencing animal ghosts is sort of it's one of those things that I talk about animal ghosts in the book. But once you see this animal city of the 1800s, you can't really unsee it. And I do the same thing as you. I walk around and I'm looking for it, and I see it everywhere. I take my students out in both my Boston history class and my urban history class when we can, when we're able to, and we look at the evidence of this animal city. So if you know what you're looking for, you know what a 19th century stable architecture looks like. And so you can walk streets of the Back Bay and you can see, oh, this was a stable, but now it's like some fancy boutique store or some loft. And who knows if they know that they were once a stable. But there are, tens or even hundreds of horse water fountains in many of our cities. The late 1800s was this period when they were building horse water fountains everywhere. And it was in part sort of this push from SPCA reformers, people who thought that horses needed to be better watered. And so these are everywhere. And sometimes you'll look at one, you don't even know what you're looking at, but you're looking at a horse water fountain. A lot of them have been converted into planters. So they'll plant flowers there. And these are not just limited to cities. A lot of small towns will have one sort of in the center of the town. And they're very prominent, and they were a sign of some degree of civilization or decency in some cases. Sometimes, they just look like fountains have become such a decorative public piece anyway that they just sort of look like another fountain, but these actually had functions. But then in terms of thinking about sort of some of the more serious implications or dimensions of these animal ghosts, I talked a little bit about the sort of the redlining legacy, but also just in terms of thinking about how our cities are built and structured physically. there's a lot, especially, I teach in Boston, there's a lot of Boston that's laid out to be experienced on a horse carriage. Commonwealth Avenue is designed as a horse landscape. That's a landscape where you were supposed to be able to ride in what was called the Parisian style. There's the mall in the middle, and there's two sort of wide wide streets on either side that comprise the avenue. And there's these long, straight kind of tree-lined vistas. Central Park, which you talk about in your book, is very much designed to experience in a horse carriage, where you have this sort of changing vistas of from one kind of landscape to another, that it would be kind of hard to experience on foot, to go through all those different landscapes. But if you had a carriage, you could sort of experience the variety of the park. The same is true in Boston's Emerald Necklace. And so I always tell my students, when you're crossing Commonwealth Avenue, which runs right through the center of our campus, you are really crossing through this sort of this history of technology, in which you're crossing a street that was laid out to be used by horses, and of course it's being used by cars. And then there's also a trolley that runs right through the middle of it. And so if you're a pedestrian in this sort of landscape, it can be somewhat alienating, or it can feel a little strange, because you're sort of moving through this landscape that's been added to over many years, that was not really necessarily retrofitted. And then, as I said, I think the most serious implication in thinking about animal ghosts is really thinking about the disparities in urban development that we see across space, that there are these zones that were set aside, that were set on a different track historically. A lot of those zones began with trying to exclude animals from residential areas of the city, and then took on a trajectory of their own that has led to real inequalities in urban environments. That's really quite spatial. So that's what I mean by animal ghosts.
One of the things that I found when I was doing research on Central Park was that right at the moment where they're expelling a lot of the livestock from the park, and like the owned livestock, like the pigs and the goats and various chickens and geese and stuff, when they were kind of creating the pounds in the park and started regulating that, there was the same moment where all these very wealthy Americans, typically New Yorkers, but it was anybody, was starting to send animals, exotic animals, into New York for like the new menagerie. So at first there was no menagerie, and they're just like sending in some animal from the American West that they had captured on a hunting trip, and hoping that it could just live in the park and kind of mill about. And then eventually they started establishing the what would become the Central Park Zoo. But there were a lot of starts and stops to this, right? But it was the same moment of like the common animals were being expelled, and then the exotic animals were being brought in. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is this kind of creation of animals as entertainment, or like this transformation from like the working animal city to the animal as exhibit or entertainment kind of thing. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about that transformation. So it's such an interesting one.
Yeah, what you say about Central Park is so interesting, that if you just focus on the animals, these spaces undergo a really remarkable transformation. So in Central Park, you have those animals that are living in sort of these shanty town environments with folks who are basically squatting, and then there's this big public effort to uproot those people and uproot those animals, and to replace them with a more refined landscape. And that happens in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park as well. A lot of these big 19th century parks have a zoo that is connected with them, either a zoo in the park or a zoo right next to the park. And to get that transformation in urban animal life requires a lot of intervention. And it, as you said, there's a special department in most cities that's like the park pound, and that's going to crack down on if you try to put a herd of sheep or a herd of goats or something in the park. They will impound those animals. And but what the public powers are doing is creating these spaces where people can go and sort of experience these special animals, these animals that are coming from farther distances, that are more interesting, that sort of allow urban residents to have contact with this broader world. And so I talk a lot about that and the process of building these zoos in the late 1800s, these zoos for urban leisure, for urban consumption. And there's this vast network of wild animal traders who are going out and capturing all the species for these zoos, and often in quite brutal and quite brutal ways. Because one of the things that they want is they want to get the animals that are young. And so that often requires taking out the adult size rhino, for example. So there's one in building the New York zoo, now the Bronx Zoo. I think they said that they needed to kill 40 rhinos to get 3 or something like that. And so there's this major international network of animal traders that are providing for these cities. And so it's part of this, that these more sort of established, refined, as they're calling themselves and sort of grooming themselves to be, larger scale zoos in the late 1800s. That's really changing how people experience animals in cities too.
Okay, Andrea, before we open this up to the Q&A, I just want to ask you, what's next for you? What are there going to be animals or cities in your next project? What are you up to?
Yeah, as Graham mentioned, that my next project is about ice, and it's about ice in the 1800s, and it's sort of a history of what I call a economic, environmental, cultural, social history of ice and climate. And so it seems like kind of a big departure from animals, but I think it's actually connected. And here's how it's connected, which is that, in order for a lot of, I talk in Animal City about sort of the regulatory dimensions of the creation of modern landscapes and modern dimensions of humans and animal spaces and interactions. And ice is a big part of that too, because you really need ice to create the refrigeration that also affects these large scale transformations. And it goes beyond animals, because it's about production and consumption in a very, very widespread kind of way. And it's about, in a sense, it's about what urban consumers can consume. Ice completely transforms what is available to urbanites across the United States.
Terrific, thank you. We've had quite a number of questions come in, and one of the first came in was about dogfighting and the growth of the SPCAs. I wonder if I could also sort of jump on that and say, ask you to talk a little bit about the relationship between animal protection movements and others, because obviously what you're writing about is a period which is a great period of urban reform more generally. And were these the same people who are against dogfighting who are involved in other reform movements, or is this a sort of separate, very, very separate sphere of reform?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll take the dogfighting part first. There is some dogfighting in the book, but as you said, it is this sort of practice that is a concern to the SPCA. The SPCA is not one thing. It's sort of a series of small organizations, but they are very concerned with blood sport, animal blood sport, and they do quite a bit to crack down on dog fighting, and what's called rat baiting. So there were sort of these, these competitions where dogs would kill as many rats as they could in a certain amount of time, and people trained dogs to do this, and they actually gathered up the rats from Butchertown in San Francisco. So there's this interesting kind of complicated ecology going on there too. So the SPCA is, these very sort of zealous reformers who are trying to reform human-animal relationships in order to improve society. They're doing it for the sake of animals, but they're also doing it as this idea that if we can get violence and suffering and abuse out of people's everyday lives, that they will be sort of more refined and better people, to put it very simply. And so, they're very active. And as you said, Graham, what one historian has sort of referred to antebellum activism as a sisterhood of reforms. Well, that really does continue into the late 19th century as well. A lot of the animal welfare, animal protection folks are also involved in public health movements. And so one of the SPCA's, I believe one of the SPCA's presidents had served as the head of the Board of Health. And so there's this twin kind of, it's sort of this, it's this sort of like, they're working together to essentially bring this coalition to reshaping the spaces of animal life and death in cities. And it's related to health, and it's related to humane treatment. And sometimes it's hard to exactly parse it out. And I think that it sort of fits under this umbrella of kind of like a civilizing idea in the late 19th century. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question.
No, that's great, thank you. One of the questions, we get, a couple of questions touch on where the sites are that were once stockyards, for example, and whether or not we should do more to promote knowledge of. One of the questioners says that the United Nations is built where the stockyards for New York were. I know that I went to Chicago many times and thought of it in terms of the Art Institute and the Chicago Symphony. And then people would say to me, oh, the stockyards. And I would have no clue where the stockyards have been in contemporary Chicago. Do you think we do enough to promote knowledge of where the stockyards were and what this animal history is? You talked about the animal ghosts, but do enough to make the ghosts more visible?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. What good does it do to make them more visible? I think that so when we think about, I'm assuming that some people watching this are in Boston or think about Boston. You could walk around Brighton, especially where the WGBH building is. It's a pretty prominent building in Boston, and those were the stockyards. That was a slaughterhouse district, and it's not at all clear, being in those spaces, that this was the history. And I think that bringing awareness to the history of these places, I think it could, I think that the power of doing that is understanding, and it's being able to say, okay, we understand to some degree why this place looks the way that it does. It's not because it's the people living there have neglected it. It's because there's this longer history of neglect, that there's this longer history of degradation, and that parts of Boston are sort of, refined and pristine and beautified at the expense of these other places. That these are two sort of sides of the same coin. That the refined space, I always use the example of the Boston Common. The Boston Common was a working landscape up until the early mid 1800s. It was a landscape where you would pasture animals as well. And for that space to become really a park and a garden, another part of the city had to take on that burden. And people who live in those other parts of the city, I think that those spaces deserve attention, public attention and attention of memory, attention of public resources, perhaps. So I'm not sure if that was your whole question, if I missed part of it.
I think we've got lots of questions, and I think you answered a lot of it. Catherine, do you have anything you'd like?
I wanted to add in. I've seen there's some historic preservation efforts, or at least signage efforts, with like brownfield sites and other like waste sites, which has like, the counter to that is that the landowners might not want to emphasize that this is a toxic dump and it's not good for real estate values, right? But at the same time, it's a good way to kind of think through some of the problematic issues of waste or placement, or kind of the urban treatment of animals at various points. So I think, Andy, you should be pushing like signage throughout Boston to like up the knowledge of everybody walking through Brighton and elsewhere.
I think it's tricky because, another thing to think about is as we experience urban spaces, and particularly as we experience them as sort of tourists, these are kind of unpleasant truths to confront. I don't think there are going to be many tourists who are going to, take the bus out to Brighton to look at the slaughterhouse district. And that's just, I just mentioned that because I think that, in terms of memory, so much of memory gets crafted by tourism. And it takes a lot of work among historians and people who are interested in urban history to kind of really make sure we're also paying attention to the serious stuff too, or the unpleasant stuff.
So you've just raised, Andrew, the sort of troubling moral issues that your book prompts us to think about. And to put it very sort of simplistically, one thing that one wonders is, have we actually reformed, have we improved, or have we just pushed things out of sight?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about, oh, that's where the stockyards were, but we still have stockyards. There's been in the last 48 hours, a lot of argument about a New York Times op-ed piece about Costco and the chickens it sells, and what seems to me the inhumane way in which they are raised, and perhaps not by Costco, but some other places, the inhumane way in which they're slaughtered. So I want to sort of draw you both out on have we got better, have we reformed, or are we just very good at hiding things that our predecessors lived face to face with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it's one that I've sort of grappled with a lot in writing this book and thinking about these issues. And I don't know if I have, I think I had hoped that in sort of writing about the history of, in part, the history of treatment of animals and how people think about animals and interact with animals historically, that I would have a little more clarity in our present moment. And maybe I do, but it still seems sort of vexing to me. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, what strikes me as really interesting about this history, about the 1800s, is this is the period when they are building that separation between the products that they consume and the unpleasant realities that go into to producing, to making those products. And I can't say with any certainty whatsoever that being a cow in a city in 1820 is any better than being a cow in a feedlot at a major industrial farm today would be better or worse. I think that it would really vary by the particular animal. But I think that what happened in the 19th century was they began a process of making these spaces invisible. And so even if you were not a butcher, you would have known where the butchers were. You would have known where the slaughterhouses were. You would have seen the cattle drives through the street. You would have seen pigs in the street. You would have been closer to that process in some way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the animals who experienced that process did any better. But I think what it does is it really opens up a feature of modern life for many of us, which is that we have this separation. And that separation, I think, in part creates a greater sensitivity to animal suffering and slaughter and it makes that chasm sort of makes the contradictions greater, if that makes sense. But I think absolutely this is the beginning of a process of those worlds becoming more and more invisible to most consumers. And we're in this moment. We've had moments like this in the past. Upton Sinclair wasn't trying to advocate for animal rights, but he collapsed that distance in 1906. He collapsed that chasm. And people saw into those slaughterhouses in a way. And I think the last 20 years or so, there's been a similar moment of exposés and documentaries and, that article was in the New York Times. New York Times is covering this. Vox covers this all the time. These industrial agricultural, sort of, what do they think it was, catastrophes of one kind or another, ecological, humane, and so forth. So the question is, will that chasm persist? I mean, what we have the chasm. We built the chasm in the 19th century, and will more exposés, will more words and videos produced about it do anything? And I don't know the answer to that.
Apologies for any background noise. My dog has decided to join us.
How fitting.
Catherine, would you like to add any thoughts on this?
Well, I just I echo what Andy has already said. I think there were exposés in the mid 19th century with the swill milk that both Andy and I write about, where they were hidden behind windowless warehouse kind of structures, and so there was a major illustrated exposé about that. Then you have Upton Sinclair and that exposé. And then Food Inc. and Michael Pollan and all the stuff in the last. So there's this perpetual exposing of the food industry, but it continues to grow further and further from our sight. So I do think that a lot of the patterns that we're seeing in Animal City in this book really kind of show that sort of movement, out of sight, out of mind, where you're not really interacting with the animals and especially the animals that people are eating. Or are working animals in the same way that we once did. Graham, I think you're muted.
Sorry. So if you wanted just to take away one sort of central theme, Andrew, what would it be? I mean, I've in a way tipped my hand about what you left me thinking about. Is there any sort of central theme that you'd like? What from the author's perspective? What would you like us to?
That's an interesting question. I think. Well, if I could cop out by picking a couple things. I think that, as I've said, the first is sort of thinking about questions of our cities and urban development, and thinking about how pathways of development emerge. That this history is important in understanding that and understanding why certain places look the way that they do, how they've taken different paths, and that those paths were very much public policy of the 19th century in a sense, and that we ought to grapple with it in some way. And the second is thinking about that chasm that has emerged in the 19th century, and what does it mean to be sort of be modern Americans living in a world with these sites of highly visible kind of interactions with animals that we keep in our homes, and then this very invisible but even more pervasive world of animal production. And then finally, just as kind of like a pitch for history, I think that people who pick up Animal City will sort of be astonished. And I think astonishment is a great thing too in thinking about history, in that this really was a different world in a lot of ways. It was a different world, both in experiencing what is a city like in the 1800s? What is it like to live in these spaces with all these other animals? And then there's just sort of astonishing moments where you realize, well, people really think about their worlds, think about one another, think about animals in very different ways than our own. And so I think that I think that there's kind of an astonishment that I hope people come away with as well.
I certainly took away that point about the continuity in the beginning of the shaping of the city, and the continuity in those neighborhoods that were disfavored. Catherine, give you a chance to say what are the main things that you would like to take away from the book and the discussion today.
I think it's just how smelly urban spaces once were. How if you get a chance to take a time machine, don't go back to the 19th century necessarily, but also just how dominant animals were, that they were, and they still are in many ways, a major part of urban spaces, even whether we control them or not, whether they're cockroaches or pigeons or rats, they're there and they live with us. And they shape the way that cities, that we think about health, human health and animal health, in the pandemic or otherwise, and will continue to as the human race continues on or doesn't.
Well, it's been a great pleasure for me to read the book, and a great pleasure for me to listen to the two of you discuss it this afternoon. So, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us from Portland. And Andrew, congratulations on the book. It's a terrific book, and I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to talk about it today. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.